This episode is sponsored by Squarespace. Whether you need a domain, website, or online store, make your next move with Squarespace.
I think the common assumption is that if you're going to get into shooting strobes with portraits, it's a very expensive and complicated thing to do. It puts a lot of photographers off from even trying, but I don't think it needs to be nearly as intimidating as it is to a lot of photographers. In fact, you can do a lot with very little. A little while ago, I made a video going back to South Africa, and I took some portraits of my mentors, and a lot of you were very kind about those portraits and made some nice comments, but I was quite surprised by some people who jumped on and said, well, you obviously can't shoot that kind of portrait unless you've got pretty fancy gear. And that's obviously not true. In fact, everything I've got with me here is plenty to be able to produce stuff at exactly the same quality. So what I'm going to do is walk you through exactly what I'd use on a budget to get exactly the same kind of shots. I get why a lot of photographers find strobe intimidating. I found it intimidating at the beginning. It took me a long time to play with strobes and start to test it out because I just felt there was going to be too much to control. I couldn't really see what the light was doing, like a constant light or like daylight, and I didn't know what I was getting and how does it trigger, and it's quite difficult to control. And so I put it off for ages, but when I actually took the plunge and got into it, as a portrait photographer, it expanded the possibilities of what I could shoot so much. I mean, forget just studio. I mean, that's obvious, you need strobe for that, but even shooting outdoors in natural light and adding strobes in different ways, which I might do a video on at some stage, just expands the looks you can get and the kind of feel you can get in your images. Don't get me wrong, you can absolutely be a natural light only photographer, and that can be a legitimate creative choice. I know a lot of great natural light photographers, but I also know there are a lot of photographers out there declaring themselves natural light only photographers, and it's more because of a fear of ever wanting to touch strobes. I'll show you my very untechnical way of setting up lights and getting a good exposure. I've never been very technical about light meters and the rest of it, so I've got a very simple technique which I use to get a quick exposure that stays the same and is constant through the whole shoot. And I'm just going to show you with one light, because I think if you're going to start in strobe, it's good just to begin with one light, learn how to use that light well, and then start adding lights as you go. And to be honest, my images nowadays, 95% of my images are all one light because I just like the really clean and classical look. So hopefully when I show you how simple this is, it's going to give you the courage to at least give it a go for yourself. Okay, so let me show you the gear I'm using. I'm literally just in my lounge. It's like a normal London flat. It's not very big, so it will kind of give you an idea of, you know, how much you can do in a small space, especially when you've got a little bit of gear. We'll start out with the backdrop. So these you can pick up off Amazon. Pretty much most online retailers will sell them. All you need to search for is something like this is a 2 meter by 1.5 meter collapsible backdrop. This one has a reversible surface so that you can actually choose different colors. I've got black on one side and white on the other, and today we're just going to use the black. So it just flips out like that, and all I'm going to do, and all I would do in someone else's house, is just prop that up against the wall here. I'm just using a little fake fireplace because that will do the job. And the other thing I have inside here is a little handheld reflector, but I'll get to that in a second. Let's talk about the light. So here's my little travel light stand. It's a Manfrotto 5001B. The great thing about these, you can see without this little attachment, it's quite a small light stand. It folds up pretty small because the legs fold up against itself, so it ends up being really small. If you want to fit this in a suitcase, it's really, really great because you could take this attachment off the top, which I'll show you in a second, and it's really nice and small. So all you do is loosen the legs like this. These are not very expensive. Manfrotto are a little more pricey than the other ones, but you can get some generic collapsible light stands that really aren't that expensive at all. And the clever thing about it is it's actually got 4 sections which you can raise up, so it can go quite high. It can go to almost 2 meters at the point where your adapter meets the end of the light stand. Because of those 4 sections, they can telescope up, but it can also go down pretty small. So the actual head that I use, the adapter that I use for my lights here, is a Bowen's Speedlight mount. That's probably what you want to search for. And I'll show you why these are great. So let me grab the light that I'm going to use. The light is my Godox Speedlight. You can use any Speedlight. I used to use the little Yungno Speedlights, which are really cheap, really inexpensive, but the light output of those is exactly the same and they're really good. A lot of the more powerful ones of those is all manual lights, but I only use Speedlights in manual anyway. I don't use TTL. I'll get into that in a second. And the little Godox trigger, but we'll get to that too when we get to the camera. So the reason this is great is because it's a Bowens S-mount adapter, so you can clip on any soft boxes or collapsible beauty dishes, which I often use, onto this with these 3 pins. It clicks in place. It gives you a lot of options in terms of the modifiers you can use, and it's also got a little umbrella hole at the bottom, so you can put an umbrella as well. And because your Speedlight actually clamps into the middle like this, it means that the light is centered in the middle of where your softbox is attached. There's another bracket which a lot of people use, and it's this one. It's this little kind of L bracket, and what you normally do is put a cold shoe on top, and that means that you can attach the Speedlight. Say you've got a cold shoe mount on the top of this. I'm just showing you why I don't use these in particular. And then the Speedlight sits on top here, and you can angle this in, and then if you want your umbrella bracket, the umbrella sticks through the bottom. But you can see how much distance there is between the center of that umbrella and the Speedlight. It's kind of shooting into the top of the umbrella and not actually into the center of it, which is why I don't use these very much. I use this because it means that the light is hitting right into the center of your modifier. Because if you stick the Speedlight or the softbox on the front here, the light goes right into the middle. If you've got your umbrella here, the light is almost hitting bang in the middle as well. So I find these really useful. Another nice little thing about these as well is I've got one with a handle on it. So if I'm ever using a light outside with an assistant, I can actually have an assistant hand hold this with an umbrella on front or a softbox and just hold it over the subject and be able to move around. What I think in the industry is called a voice-activated light stand, which just means someone who's kind enough to stand there and hold everything for you. In terms of the modifier, I use a bunch of modifiers, but this is pretty much one of the cheapest options I think you can find. They're called soft lighters in a lot of places, and this one I picked up. It's a generic one. It's not actually the soft lighter brand. It's a Wally-Mex Pro. I think it's a 120 centimeter, and I'll show you what it does. This is a very, very inexpensive. I think these are 20 pounds on Amazon, and it gives a beautiful soft light. It folds up incredibly small. You can literally just carry this against the stand when you're walking around. So you've got this and the stand in one hand, you've got the backdrop in the other, and the backpack with your camera and a Speedlight. Super simple. So I'll show you how this works. If you look inside, all I'm going to do is open this out just like an umbrella, and what happens is the light shoots inside and then it fills this space and it comes bouncing back out through this diffusion material. So it has a nice bounce and then back through the diffusion material, means it gives you quite a big soft light source. And all I'm going to do to attach this is put this through my umbrella piece at the bottom here. There we go. Make sure it's turned up to the top. Just need to twist this up a second and make sure this is lined up here. Put the skirt over the actual bracket, pull it closed, and then zip it, and then tighten this so it doesn't move around, the actual umbrella doesn't move around. And that means that I'm going to get a really nice soft light source, basically like a nice softbox style light source. For the actual Speedlight, I'm going to make sure when I turn it on that I am set to 24 mil. Okay, so with lots of Speedlights you can change the angle of the light. I want this at the widest angle possible, so when the light goes in here it's going to fill as much of that modifier as possible and come back out as soft as possible. So I don't want it zoomed in at 105 or whatever. I want it as wide as possible. So it's 24 mil on here, and I'm making sure that's set. It's set to manual, and I'll show you how I shoot with that in a second. And that's pretty much my light source. So I'm going to pop this over here. I'm going to pop my stool down for my subject, and we are ready to start shooting and seeing if we can get a good exposure. So Sarah's kindly agreed just to sit in on this, just to give us a subject. The first thing I want to do is position my light, and I'm going to move this around and try different looks as we go. Basically, I want to make sure all the time that this umbrella stick is pointing at her head, roughly speaking. That just gives me a guideline. I don't always want it facing directly. You can kind of move it around and cheat it a little bit, but that gives me an idea of where it's pointing. So first of all, I want to get it high enough. And I normally start with a basic kind of Rembrandt light, which kind of means that if I want a Rembrandt light, which is at one side of the face lit nicely and just light spinning around just on the opposite cheek to give that little triangle, the rough rule is to be 45 degrees off axis and 45 degrees above. So if I put it about here, I should get a fairly nice Rembrandt light. Now I've got my black background behind, so I know my background's gonna be nice and dark, but at the moment I can see that the light's gonna spill quite a bit on that background, and I wanna prevent that a little bit. So what I'm gonna do is cheat it, and this is called feathering, which means that the light's still positioned sort of where I want. It's still gonna wrap around a bit, and I can move it and adjust it so that I can change the light look as I go. But by feathering it means it's going to keep it off the background, it's not facing the background as much, and it's going to spill past Sarah a little bit, and I'm going to get some of these softer edges instead of the very middle of the light source, and that's really going to help. And as I go, I'm going to try different things. So if I want more drama in the image, if I want more shadow, I'm going to take it around to the side. And that's going to mean that I'm going to start to get split lighting, where all of one side of the face is going to be covered in shadow. If I bring it more round to the front and more overhead, which I'll do at some stage, it's going to give a softer, nicer kind of beauty lighting look. So you'll get that nice T-zone with sort of the hot forehead and nose and cheeks, and it'll suck in the cheeks on the side because it'll create a bit of shadow, and maybe sort of lips and the bottom of the chin. So it gives nice shape. So it's going to depend from split lighting to sort of Rembrandt to kind of more overhead beauty. I can start to move that around and play with looks and sort of a style that I want to get. So that's the light setup. The power on it is 1/32 power. I mean, I don't even know if that's right at the moment. I'll get to that in a second. I'll show you my very untechnical way for getting exposure reading. I've never been much of a light meter guy. I don't really get that technical. I like to see what I'm going to get in the camera, so you'll see how I get an exposure now. I'm obviously on manual mode. I don't use TTL, so the flash is on manual as well. I just find TTL sometimes if the metering changes at all, then the flash changes and you're trying to keep up and you're trying to meter differently. If I just set it manual in camera, manual on the flash, it stays the whole way through the shoot exactly at that power, and I don't need to mess around. So I know what my settings need to be. I want to be on ISO 100, lowest possible to keep the noise out. I am on f2.8 because I'm on the Sony a7 III, which is a full frame camera, and my favorite lens for portraits at the moment is this 55mm Zeiss 1.8. I like 50mm, 55mm for portraits at the moment. It's just become my favorite focal length. I used to be an 85mm guy, but I find you're a lot further away from your subject with 85mm. 55 to 50 sort of gives you a bit more intimacy. You can get in a bit closer to your subject. It doesn't distort, but it kind of gives you a slightly more intimate feel, which I really like. And if you're shooting portraits outdoors, it gives a bit more context, which I enjoy as well. So I'm on 2.8 because that's the sort of depth of field I want. 55mm on a full frame at 2.8 is going to give me a sharp front of the face. By the time you get to the ears, it's going to be slightly blurry. Back of the head, you're going to be blurred out, and that's exactly the sort of depth of field I want. And I am at the moment on 1/200th of a second on my shutter speed. And my shutter speed is what I'm going to change probably the most to sort of dial in the light the way that I want it, between the shutter speed and the actual light itself. You need to check. The luxury I have with this trigger and this light is that it has high speed sync, which means I can push my shutter speed really fast and the flash will keep up. But I mean, when I used to use the Yongnuo flashes, for example, I didn't have high speed sync between the trigger and the flash, and you get the issue called flash sync, which means your screen starts to fill up with black because the faster your shutter speed goes, your shutter is firing too fast for your light to keep up and be captured. So you need to check which flash you're using and when you start to get those issues. I remember my Canons used to be about 1/160th of a second. But because I've got this trigger, this light, the Godox setup, I've got high speed sync, which means I can go right up to 4,000th of a second. It's not a problem. Now, I don't know if this exposure is going to be right. So the only way to do it really is to just take a test shot. I know my ISO is going to stay the same, my aperture is going to stay the same, and I'm going to balance the rest to get the look I want in camera. And once it's there, I can just shoot all day. So I'm just going to take a test shot. And Sarah's eyes are closed, which are lovely. And I'm pretty much where I want to be, actually. I might just brighten it a touch. So just adjusting it on here, I'm going to change up to 1/16 power, something like that. And I'm going to take another shot, and that's pretty much a good exposure. Now I know I don't need to touch anything now. That exposure will stay the same because the manual settings aren't moving. I don't have to rely on metering if anything changes in the space, and also the light isn't changing either, it's staying at the same power. So I'm going to get a really consistent look the whole way through and just be able to move the light slightly to adjust the look of the light and to adjust the power. One quick thing to mention is you want to make sure that none of the ambient light is influencing your shot, that the only light on your subject is your actual strobe light. So you can see that there is light in this room. I just need to make sure that this light is so powerful and I'm exposing for it that when I expose correctly for the strobe, none of the ambient light is visible. And the quick way to do that is to literally just turn your trigger off. So now my light won't fire, and to take a test shot. And the screen on the back of my camera, which you can see, should all be black. I shouldn't be able to see any image. And that means that the light we can see here, this exposure is set so low that it doesn't pick any of this ambient light up. So I know the only light that's influencing my shot is the strobe, which is all I want. And I can turn my strobe back on and take a shot, and I can see that only my strobe is visible. If you don't check this, you might find that there's, you know, a tungsten light in the room and you're getting a bit of tungsten light washing in with your strobe light, or there's light from the sun that's coming in, it's filling all your shadows and you're not getting the drama in the shot that you want. If you want to totally control your shot, make sure the light is exactly what you intend. This is a really, really crucial step. The only other little bits I've got are a gray card. So the first shot I'm going to take is on a gray card. You can get cheap gray cards. Just have a look at the reviews if you're buying them and make sure the gray is an accurate middle gray so that you can color pick on it in Lightroom and make sure all your colors are accurate. You could get one of these, which is a color checker passport, and you can get very fancy. You can actually use the color tiles in this and run software in Lightroom and other programs which will make sure that your colors, all the different colors across the spectrum, are exactly accurate. Personally, I don't faff with that too much. I just hold a gray card up front and then just make sure that I grab the shot just to back towards your face a little bit more. And then what you're making sure is that the light that's going to hit your subject hits that gray card. I can color pick that first shot, and I know that my white balance is going to be good all the way through. It's already set to flash white balance in camera, so I'm where I need to be, but that gray card is going to make sure just that last little bit that my colors are accurate all the way through, because flashes are all slightly different temperatures, different cameras treat color slightly differently. This sort of helps you technically to get right where you need to be. The only other little thing I take around with me, which is in that case with the backdrop, is a little pop-up handheld reflector. And this I just have below me here. Sometimes I get my subject to hold it as well. And this just means if the shadows under the chin are getting a little harsh, I can sort of pull this in or out just to make sure that the light is bouncing back in and filling as much as I want. I don't want too much of this because I want shadow and shape, but this helps me control how much. And it also just gives a lovely little catch light in the bottom of the eye because you can see that circle of white light reflected. So that's my setup. I'm going to fire through a bunch of different looks. We're going to try some different tops and move the light around a little bit to see what looks we can get with a very, very basic setup in quite a small space. So I hope this has shown you that you can actually produce really quality portraits with just a little bit of gear, stuff that's pretty affordable and isn't a lot to carry around. You could also build a kit a lot cheaper than I've done in this video. You could, instead of using the Sony a7 III like I've got, you could go and pick yourself up a second-hand Canon 5D Mark I or a Mark II for way cheaper. You could get yourself a Canon 50mm 1.4, get yourself a One Speedlight as well. Those things are really cheap, and a generic trigger. You can have a cheap foldable light stand, one of these pop-up backdrops which really doesn't cost very much, and one of those little soft lighters I showed you. And you could probably build a kit for about 600, 700 pounds, and that's a completely mobile studio that you can shoot quality headshots or portraits anywhere you go. And you could travel around even smaller than this. I mean, you could just go with this if you know that you've got a background on location or somewhere, or even in your house, that you can use in the shot. But if you're going to use these, and they're really inexpensive and really useful as backdrops, this is probably the most practical tip I can give you, because there's nothing worse than shooting with a client with one of these backgrounds and then getting to the end of your shoot and realizing that you actually can't fold the thing up. I used to have assistants who struggle with these. It would take them a few minutes at the end of shoots to get it done. There is a trick to it that gets it done quickly. All you want to do is put it in front of you, two hands at the top here, fold it in half, rotate your hands around so you're facing a different way, and then just fold it in on itself from both sides. So I'll do it again. So just at the top, 10 and 2, fold it in half, rotate your hands around, and then twist it against each other, and then it's small enough, and that will save you looking like a little bit of a muppet. It's true that speedlights have their limitations. You're never going to take them outside and battle the midday sun with them. They just don't have that kind of power output. But when you're shooting studio portraits, you're always indoors in an environment where you can control the ambient light. I mean, you saw me shooting in my lounge. All I did was draw the curtains so the ambient light didn't overpower the strobe or influence the exposure in any way, and I was only capturing the strobe, and then it's plenty. And if I told you I took those images in a fancy studio with fancy lights and you hadn't seen the process, would you really have known I was lying? So don't let a lack of money or huge amounts of fancy gear put you off. If you can get together enough just to get this basic kit, you can produce really good images that you can be very proud of. Thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. If you need a new website or a domain, they really are a fantastic option. I've used them myself for years now. Back in the beginning, when I started shooting headshots and portraits for a business, I did two things right up front. The first was I got hold of friends and models and shot around as much as possible to build up images for a portfolio. And the second thing was to get myself a website, and I chose Squarespace so that I could load up all those images onto a good looking site and then point potential clients to them so they could see what I was doing. I was always really proud to send people to my website, especially in those early days, because I was producing images I was proud of, but the website itself was such a clean and minimal place that made my images sing. The templates that Squarespace have got are really modern and crisp, and they put your images front and center. If you want to take a look at my site, I've used a template called Wexley for years now, and that's been the visual home for my work.
Start your free trial today at squarespace.com and go to squarespace.com/Sean Tucker to get 10% off your first purchase.